Hey everyone, welcome to my channel from start to now. If you love uncovering hidden stories from history, you're in the right place. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss our future videos. Let's dive in. Imagine this for a second. It's the dead of night. Torches flicker in the cold mountain air. 500 exhausted knights, bruised, hungry, and outnumbered beyond imagination, look down into a valley where tens of thousands of enemy soldiers are sleeping. One wrong move and they are erased from history. And yet, before the sun rises, Europe's future will be changed forever. This is the story of how a tiny force stood against overwhelming odds, how faith, fear, strategy, and surprise collided, and how a single battle echoed across centuries. Stay with me, because this is not just a story of swords and armor. This is a story of survival. When we talk about medieval warfare, we often imagine massive armies clashing in open fields, banners flying, drums beating, and commanders shouting orders from horseback. But history doesn't always work like that. Sometimes it turns on moments of chaos, miscalculation, and bold decisions that seem almost insane at the time. This battle is one of those moments. It took place during a period when Europe was under constant pressure, when borders were fragile, kingdoms were divided, and fear of invasion shaped politics, religion, and daily life. On one side were heavily armed knights, trained from childhood for war, bound by oaths, and driven by a belief that retreat meant destruction. On the other side was a vastly larger Muslim army, confident in its numbers, experienced in campaigning, and convinced victory was inevitable. The numbers themselves sound unbelievable. 500 against 20, 6,000. Even by medieval standards, that gap is staggering. Historians still debate the exact figures, and it's important to say that medieval sources often exaggerated enemy numbers to make victories seem more miraculous. But even if we reduce those figures, even if we cut them in half or more, the imbalance remains extraordinary. This was not supposed to be a fair fight. It was supposed to be a slaughter. To understand how this moment happened, we need to step back and look at the world as it was. Europe at the time was a patchwork of feuding kingdoms and territories. Alliances shifted constantly, rulers died young, and succession crises were common. Meanwhile, Muslim powers had expanded rapidly across North Africa and into parts of southern Europe, bringing advanced military organization, strong leadership, and a confidence built on decades of success. Raids and campaigns pushed deeper into European lands, not just for conquest, but for wealth, influence, and strategic dominance. For the people living in these border regions, war wasn't a distant concept. It was personal. Villages could be burned overnight, crops destroyed, families taken prisoner or killed. So when news spread that a massive Muslim force was advancing, panic followed. Many believed resistance was pointless. Some local leaders fled. Others prepared for the worst, assuming defeat was inevitable. But among the knights who gathered there was a different mindset. They knew they were outnumbered. They knew help was not coming. And yet retreat meant leaving their lands open, their people defenseless, and their future uncertain. For them, standing their ground was not about glory. It was about necessity. They believed that if this army broke through, nothing would stop the advance further into Europe. As the opposing forces maneuvered, the larger army settled into what seemed like a position of total dominance. Camps were established, supplies organized, and confidence ran high. Why wouldn't it be? With such overwhelming numbers, the idea that a small force could pose any real threat seemed laughable. Guards were posted, of course, but vigilance faded as fatigue set in. Commanders assumed they had time. Time to plan, time to rest, time to finish this on their terms. The knights, meanwhile, were making a decision that would define the battle. They knew that meeting the enemy in open combat during daylight would be suicide. Heavy cavalry charges were powerful, but only when momentum and formation were on your side. Against such numbers, they would be surrounded and cut down, so they chose something else, something desperate, something audacious. They would attack at night. Night battles in the medieval world were rare and terrifying. There were no floodlights, no radios, no clear lines of command once chaos began, but that chaos could be a weapon. The knights understood that fear multiplied in darkness, sounds carried strangely, confusion spread faster than any messenger, and a sudden attack could turn confidence into panic within minutes. As darkness fell, the knights prepared in silence. Armor was checked, weapons secured, prayers whispered. These were men who understood they might not survive until morning. Yet there was a strange calm among them. When you accept that death is possible, even likely, fear loses some of its power. What remains is focus. They moved carefully, using the terrain to their advantage. Hills, trees, and narrow paths concealed their approach. Horses were kept under tight control, hooves muffled as much as possible. Every step mattered. One clatter of metal, one shouted warning, and the element of surprise would be lost. Then it happened. The attack exploded into the sleeping camp like a storm. Knights charged through tents, swords flashing, lances breaking, war cries tearing through the night. Fires were overturned, plunging parts of the camp into darkness, while others burned brightly, casting wild shadows that made the attackers seem far more numerous than they were. For the soldiers caught off guard, it was a nightmare. Waking from sleep to screams, fire, and steel is disorienting beyond words. Units struggled to form. Orders were shouted but lost in the noise. Some believed they were under attack by a massive force. Others thought betrayal had occurred within their own ranks. This is where psychology mattered more than numbers. The larger army had never expected this. Confidence became confusion. Confusion became fear. Fear became panic, and panic is contagious. The knights didn't try to fight everyone. They struck key points, commanders' tents, supply areas, and escape routes. Wherever resistance formed, they moved on quickly, leaving the impression of an unstoppable wave rather than a small, focused force. Horses thundered through narrow spaces, trampling men and equipment alike. The sound alone was enough to break morale. As the chaos spread, parts of the Muslim army began to retreat, not knowing how many enemies they faced or where safety lay. In the darkness, retreat turned into flight. Units collided with each other. Orders contradicted one another. The camp, once a symbol of strength, became a trap. By the time dawn approached, the battle was effectively over. The knights, battered and bloodied, withdrew before the full scale of the enemy could regroup. What they left behind was devastation and disbelief. The larger army, shocked by losses and shaken in confidence, abandoned the campaign. Now it's important to pause here. Stories like this are often told as simple tales of good versus evil, of one side being heroic and the other villainous. But history is more complex. The soldiers on both sides were human beings, shaped by their cultures, beliefs, and circumstances. They fought because they were ordered to, because they believed in their cause, or because survival demanded it. What makes this battle remarkable is not just who won, but how it was won. It demonstrates that warfare is not only about numbers and strength. It's about timing, leadership, morale, and the willingness to take risks when all other options seem closed. The aftermath of the battle sent shockwaves across the region. For Europe, it was a moment of relief and renewed confidence. It showed that invasion was not inevitable, that resistance was possible, even against overwhelming odds. Leaders used the story to inspire unity, to justify defenses, and to rally support for future campaigns. For the Muslim powers involved, it was a harsh lesson in complacency. Overconfidence had turned a strong position into a vulnerability. The loss did not end their presence or influence, but it forced a reassessment of strategy and assumptions. Over time, the story grew. Chroniclers embellished details, numbers increased, speeches were invented, the battle became legend. 500 knights became symbols of divine favor, courage, and destiny. And, like all legends, it served the needs of those who told it. But even when we strip away the exaggeration, the core truth remains powerful. A smaller force, facing near certain defeat, chose action over surrender. They understood their enemy's weaknesses and exploited them with precision. They used fear as a weapon and turned the knight into an ally. This battle didn't single-handedly save Europe, despite what some dramatic titles suggest. History is never that simple, but it played a role. It slowed expansion, it changed perceptions, and it reminded everyone involved that the future was not predetermined. When we look at this story today, it's easy to focus on the violence, the numbers, and the drama. But there's a deeper lesson here. It's about how moments of crisis can force extraordinary decisions, about how underestimating an opponent can be fatal, and about how belief, whether in faith, homeland, or each other, can push people to attempt the impossible. Think about how many times in history, and even in our own lives, we face situations that seem unwinnable. The odds feel stacked, the numbers don't add up, and yet sometimes the outcome depends not on how big the challenge is, but on how creatively and courageously it's faced. That's why this story still matters, not because of who fought whom, but because of what it reveals about human behavior under pressure. Fear can paralyze, but it can also sharpen the mind. Confidence can inspire, but it can also blind. And sometimes the smallest force, acting at the right moment, can change everything. So the next time you hear a story about impossible odds, remember this night. Remember the silence before the charge, the chaos that followed, and the way history turned on a decision made in the dark. If you found this story gripping, if it made you see history in a new way, make sure you stay with this channel. From forgotten battles to moments that shaped the world, we're just getting started. Picture this continuing story like the camera never cut, like we're still standing on that same battlefield, the smoke still hanging in the air, the echoes of screams fading into the cold morning wind. Because the real power of this moment doesn't end when the swords stop swinging. In many ways, that's where the story truly begins. As the sun rose over the hills, the knights looked around and could hardly believe what they had survived. Bodies lay scattered, abandoned tents flapped in the breeze, and weapons were left where terrified soldiers had dropped them in flight. These men were not celebrating yet. There was no cheering, no triumph. Mostly there was silence, a heavy, stunned silence that comes when you realize you're still alive after expecting death. Some knights knelt to pray, others checked on wounded comrades, many simply stared, trying to understand how a force so small had shattered an army so vast. News of what happened spread fast, carried by messengers, refugees, and rumors that grew with every retelling. By the time the story reached distant towns and royal courts, the numbers had already begun to grow. 500 became fewer, 26,000 became more, the fear became greater, and so did the miracle. People didn't just hear about a military victory, they heard about divine intervention, about destiny choosing sides, about proof that Europe was protected. And this is where myth and history start to intertwine. Medieval Europe ran on stories. Most people would never read a chronicle or see a battlefield. What they knew of the world came from sermons, songs, and tales told around fires. This battle became one of those stories. It was told to frightened villagers to give them hope. It was told to young boys training to become knights, teaching them that courage mattered more than numbers. It was told by rulers who needed loyalty and unity in uncertain times. But on the other side, the shock was just as real. Imagine being part of an army that believed victory was guaranteed, only to wake up in chaos, to flee without understanding what was happening, to lose comrades without ever seeing the true size of the enemy. That kind of defeat doesn't just wound bodies, it wounds confidence. Commanders had to answer difficult questions. How did this happen? Who failed? Could it happen again? Some blamed poor discipline. Others blamed fate, some blamed God, but all understood one thing clearly: the enemy was not as weak as they had assumed. Strategically, this single night changed calculations. Campaigns were delayed. Routes were reconsidered. Resources that might have gone deeper into Europe were pulled back to secure territory already held. Even a temporary pause can have enormous consequences in history. It gives opponents time to regroup, to fortify, to form alliances that might not have existed otherwise. And alliances are everything. In the months and years that followed, European leaders used this battle as proof that cooperation was necessary. Alone, each kingdom was vulnerable. Together, they could resist. While unity was never perfect and rivalries never truly disappeared, fear has a way of pushing enemies into uneasy partnerships. This battle became a symbol of what was possible when divisions were set aside, even briefly. Now, let's talk about the knights themselves, because it's easy to turn them into faceless heroes in armor. These were not superhumans. They were men with doubts, families, rivalries, and fears. Some were younger sons with no inheritance, fighting for land or reputation. Others were veterans who had already seen too much death. Many carried scars, both physical and mental, long before this battle ever began. The decision to attack at night was not made lightly. Night fighting went against tradition. It was considered dishonorable by some, reckless by others. But desperation changes values. Survival rewrites the rules. These knights chose effectiveness over tradition, results over reputation, and that choice is one of the most important lessons of this story. History often rewards those who adapt. If they had clung to old ideas of honor and daylight battle, they would likely have been destroyed. Instead, they studied their situation honestly. They saw that the enemy relied on numbers and confidence. So they attacked confidence, they attacked sleep, they attacked fear itself. This kind of thinking appears again and again throughout history. Smaller forces defeating larger ones by choosing when and how to fight, by refusing to play by the opponent's rules, by turning weakness into an advantage. But there's another layer here that often gets overlooked. Religion played a massive role in how this battle was understood and remembered. For Christian Europe, victory was framed as divine approval. For the Muslim world, defeat was sometimes interpreted as a test or punishment. Both sides believed God was involved. And when both sides believe the same thing about opposite outcomes, conflict becomes more than political or territorial. It becomes existential. That belief fueled future wars. It hardened attitudes. It justified brutality. Stories like this didn't just inspire defense, they also inspired aggression. If God had protected Europe once, many believed, then expansion and retaliation were also justified. So while this battle slowed one advance, it fed a much longer cycle of conflict. Centuries later, historians began to peel back the layers. They questioned the numbers, they compared sources, they looked at logistics and terrain. And many concluded that while the event was real, the scale had been exaggerated. But here's the important part. Even if the numbers were smaller, the impact was still enormous. Because history isn't just shaped by what happens. It's shaped by what people believe happened. Belief influences decisions. Decisions shape events. Events become history. That's why this battle still gets attention today. Not because 500 beating 20, 6,000 is statistically impressive, but because the story itself influenced generations of thought, fear, and identity. Think about modern times. Nations still tell stories about impossible victories and heroic last stands. These stories become part of national identity. They teach children who they are supposed to be, who their enemies are supposed to be, and what values are worth dying for. This medieval battle did exactly that. It helped define the idea of Europe as something that could be defended, something worth uniting for. It helped define the other as a threat that must never be underestimated, and it reinforced the belief that destiny favored the bold. But destiny doesn't choose sides on its own. People choose actions, and actions have consequences. The knights who survived this battle did not live happily ever after. Many went on to fight again. Some died in later campaigns. Some returned home injured or broken. Some became legends in their own regions. Others were forgotten entirely, their names lost even as the story lived on. That's another uncomfortable truth about history. We remember events, not individuals. We remember numbers, not faces. We remember outcomes, not the countless small decisions and sacrifices that made those outcomes possible. When you strip away the drama, what remains is a moment where human psychology collided with military reality. Overconfidence met desperation, order met chaos, sleep met steel, and chaos won. So when people say this battle saved Europe, what they really mean is that it bought time, time for walls to be built, time for armies to reorganize, time for leaders to rethink their strategies, time for identities to harden. Time can be the most powerful weapon of all. As you listen to this story, I want you to think beyond the armor and the swords. Think about the choices. Think about the mindset. Think about how often the biggest turning points in history come from moments that, at the time, feel like pure madness. 500 knights charging into the darkness against an army that could erase them without effort sounds insane. And maybe it was, but it was also the only option they had left. And sometimes when there are no good options, the boldest one becomes the right one. If this story pulled you in, if it made you rethink what power really looks like, then you're exactly where you should be. This channel is about moments like this, where history pivots on fear, courage, and impossible choices. Stick around, because there are countless more stories where the odds were brutal, the stakes were everything, and the outcome shaped the world we live in today.